Honourable Member for Langley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member from Chilliwack-Fraser Valley for seconding this motion. I'm honoured to be standing here to speak on my new bill, C-489, an act to amend the Criminal Code and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, restrictions on offenders, and it's called the Safe at Home Bill. I do so on behalf of my constituents in Langley and other cases of young victims who have lived in fear of their offenders. I'm in awe of their bravery, their courage to fight for the rights of future victims. In my riding of Langley, two brave families lived in constant turmoil when the sex offender of their child was permitted to serve house arrest in their neighborhood. In one case, Mr. Speaker, the sex offender served the sentence right across the street from the victim, and in the other case, right next door. Mr. Speaker, that's outrageous. Each child did not feel safe in their home or their neighborhood, the very place where they should feel the safest. Their doors were locked, the blinds were kept closed. Every time they saw the sex offender, the entire family was re-victimized. The family lived in continual turmoil, and they watched the offender, looking for an opportunity possibly to re-offend or hurt somebody else. The home in the neighborhood where they had loved was now the place where they dreaded to be because their attacker was there. One family couldn't take the stress anymore, and this caused them to be forced to move out of the neighborhood that they had spent so many years loving. One mother came to my office and asked me, why should we have to move from our home when we're the victims? That's a good question, Mr. Speaker. Everyone should be able to feel safe. They should have the right to feel safe in their home. And victims of sexual assault should be no exception. That's why I brought forward Bill C-489. I believe it meets those important concerns head on. If passed, it will help to ensure the safety of victims and witnesses from convicted offenders. It will enhance the level of confidence that victims have in the justice system, as well as to help them feel that the justice system is hearing and responding to their concerns. 489 achieves these objectives by proposing a number of amendments to the Criminal Code and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act that will prevent offenders, when released from prison, from contacting victims or witnesses. Specifically, C-489 proposes when an offender is convicted of a child sexual offense, to require the sentencing court to consider imposing a specific geographic restriction of 2 kilometres from any dwelling house in which the offender knows or ought to know that a victim may be present, as well as a condition prohibiting the offender from being alone in any private vehicle with a child under the age of 16. Efforts to prevent contact between offenders and their victims should serve to increase public safety and victims' confidence in the sentencing process. The bill also would require courts to impose conditions in all probation orders and conditional sentence orders prohibiting an offender from communicating with any victim or witness or from going to any place identified in the order. Although these conditions would be mandatory, the court could decide not to impose them if the victim or witness consents, or if the court finds exceptional circumstances, in which case written reasons would be required to explain the findings. I believe that this would enhance public safety and confidence in the justice system by helping to ensure that victims and witnesses will, except in exceptional circumstances or where the individual consents, not be contacted by offenders upon their release into the community. The bill also proposes to amend recognizance or peace bonds against individuals who are reasonably feared that they may commit a future child sex offense. Specifically, it proposes to amend Section 810.1 peace bonds to require a court to consider imposing conditions prohibiting the defendant from contacting any individual or going to any place named in the recognizance. As with the proposed probation and conditional sentence order amendments, the court could choose not to impose the conditions in the peace bond where there is consent of the individual or where the court finds exceptional circumstances. I believe that this amendment will also lead to enhanced public safety for the victims and witnesses. And lastly, Bill C-489 proposes to amend the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, or the CCRA, to require decision makers under that act to consider similar conditions. I would like to consider this amendment a bit more fully. Mr. Speaker, currently under the CCRA, Parole Board of Canada tribunals and corrections officials are authorized to impose conditions on an offender when they're being released into the community under parole, stat release, or temporary absence orders. This type of gradual and supervised conditional release into the community prior to the expiration of sentence is intended to help ensure public safety and successful reintegration of the offender into society. This is especially true where the offender has been imprisoned for many years and will have difficulty re-entering society without a careful, planned, and monitored release strategy that includes tailored conditions and specialized programs that the offender must abide at all times. According to the 2012 Conditional Services of Canada annual report, there are currently about 22,000 offenders under the authority of the federal correction system. About two-thirds of those offenders were convicted of a violent or sexual offense. About 38%, almost 9,000 offenders, are at any given time under active supervision in the community by corrections officers. All 9,000 of those offenders are required to abide by a mix of mandatory or discretionary conditions imposed by the authority of the CCRA. If the offender breached their conditions, they are subject to disciplinary measures, including having their conditional release revoked and being required to serve out the remainder of their sentence in prison. As the CCRA is currently structured, Section 133 provides the authority of the Parole Board of Canada, for example, to impose at their discretion any type of condition that meets the two objectives of conditional release. The first and primary consideration is public safety. The second consideration is the successful reintegration of the offender into community. Section 133 also references the regulations of the CCRA regarding mandatory release, conditions of release. Under this legislative authority, Section 161 of the regulations prescribe a number of specific conditions that must be imposed for all offenders in the community under conditional release, such as reporting as required to their parole officer, not possessing any weapons, and reporting any changes in their address or employment, among others. While it is not uncommon for the Parole Board of Canada under the current regime to exercise its discretion to impose conditions prohibiting contact between offenders and victims when released, the point is that these are not mandatory conditions, nor are these conditions the conditions that the Parole Board of Canada is required to consider under the current Section 133. I spoke earlier about the two cases in my writing of Langley where the victims and their families felt that their welfare had not been taken into account when these decisions were made by the Parole Board of Canada. One of the objectives of Bill C-489 is to respond to these types of concerns. It proposes new mandatory conditions prohibiting the offender from communicating from any identified victims or witnesses, and from going to a place identified in the condition. I believe that this objective is entirely consistent with the government's initiatives that have provided a greater emphasis on safer communities in general and victims in particular. As with the bill's other proposed amendments, the releasing authority does not have to impose the condition if there are exceptional circumstances. Excuse me. The releasing authority does not have to impose the condition if there are exceptional circumstances or if the identified individual consents. These two exceptions ensure that the provision is flexible enough to accommodate the types of circumstances that will undoubtedly occur in practice. Where the releasing authority does find that exceptional circumstances do exist, reasons for making that finding must be provided in writing, explaining how it came to that conclusion. I believe this requirement will ensure that victims and witnesses better understand the Parole Board's decisions. I expect that the Standing Committee of Justice and Human Rights will want to fully consider this bill and its operational impacts to ensure that it operates as intended and that its objectives are fully achieved. Mr. Speaker, public confidence in our justice system is important. It pains me to hear from victims victims of crime, that they have to speak out to say that they have been forgotten and that the justice system doesn't consider how sentencing affects them, the victims. This is a gap that C-489 seeks to address, and I believe it hits the mark. I hope that by tabling this bill, this House and the government will act to enhance public safety by holding criminals accountable, by enhancing the voice of the victims, and by making victims feel safe in their homes and their neighborhoods. I ask for support from the honourable members in this House in helping to get this bill passed into law so that young victims and their families and neighborhoods can feel safe at home. Thank you so much.